Hello there, Physically Debunked here, and today I'm going to be talking about an argument for God's existence based on set theory, which I saw over on Adherent Apologetics. Appearing on this channel, a YouTuber by the name of Apologetics Squared argued that set theory offers evidence for God's existence. I like my set theory, so I was interested to see what the argument was going to appeal to. Let's find out.
So the argument from sets, we're going to start off with two views in the philosophy of mathematics that are divided on the nature of mathematical entities. So stuff like numbers, functions, sets, or geometrical shapes. What are these things? On one side of the aisle, you have the realists who think that these things exist. On the other side, you have the anti-realists who think these things don't exist. We're going to continue on as if you're accepting all the arguments for realism.
So this argument only gets off the ground if you're a mathematical realist. That is, if you believe that mathematical entities exist in some sense. If you're an anti-realist, then you can forget about this argument straight away. But for my part, I am a mathematical realist. So let's continue.
Okay, so in realism, there are lots of views. One of them is conceptualism, and that's that these things like numbers, function sets, they are thoughts in the mind of God. Another view is kind of like, what's the name of it? Well, there's another view that these abstract objects, they kind of have like their own independent existence. They're not in the mind of God.
Okay, so there are two broad camps within mathematical realism that he's talking about here. There are realists who are Platonists. They believe that mathematical entities enjoy their own independent existence. And there are realists who are conceptualists. They believe that mathematical entities only exist within minds. Specifically, he's arguing in favour of a divine conceptualism, where mathematical entities exist in virtue of being thoughts in the mind of God.
This argument, the argument from sets, is that if you're going to be a realist, you can't be like a Platonist. You've got to be a conceptualist. So if you're going to be a realist, you can only be a conceptualist, and if you can only be a conceptualist, well, you got to commit yourself to the existence of God for these, the mind for these abstract objects to exist in. Okay, why might you think that? Well, we're actually going to have to get into set theory. So set theory is, broadly speaking, trying to mathematically formalize the concept of a collection. Now, what makes something a set? Like, what kinds of sets are there? If you want to mathematically be precise, is there a set of all sets? Is there a set that doesn't have anything in it? Is there a set which contains itself? So what the original conception of set theory was that if you have a property, then you can have a set which contains all the things with that property. The problem is that that actually arrives at a contradiction with Russell's famous paradox.
A fascinating lesson from 20th century logic and mathematics is that the idea of a collection or a set is notoriously difficult to formalize consistently. If you're not careful, you can end up with things like Russell's paradox. Russell showed that in naive set theories, you could specify a set which contained all the sets that did not contain themselves. But this set is paradoxical. If the set contains itself, then by definition, it doesn't contain itself. And if the set doesn't contain itself, then by definition, it does contain itself. The most commonly used set theory today is Zermelo-Fraenkel or ZFC set theory, and it avoids the paradoxes that plagued previous theories by stipulating how sets can be constructed in a rigid hierarchy.
The current conception of set theory is very, very intelligent. It's Zermelo-Fraenkel set theory. What it does is it structures sets hierarchically. So we start with, like, say, the empty set, the set that doesn't contain anything, and then we have rules to build more sets based off of the sets we already have. So I go from the set which contains nothing to the set which contains the set which contains nothing, and then I could have the set of the set that contains nothing as well, and also the set of the set which contains nothing. You start building up hierarchically. And these rules that give you more and more sets can give you infinitely large sets.
So in ZFC set theory, there's no such thing as a set of all sets. You can keep on building larger sets iteratively. This is analogous to the fact that there's no largest natural number. You can always construct a larger one simply by taking a natural number and adding 1 to it. In ZFC set theory, if you have a large set, you can always construct a larger one by taking the set of all subsets of that large set. This is what's known as the power set. So because you can keep doing this ad infinitum, there's no set of all sets.
Okay, well now we're going to go back to the conceptualist and the Platonist. The Platonist is going to say that these kinds of sets exist if their members exist. Like what explanation is for the existence of these sets? The members exist. What's going to be the explanation on conceptualism? Well, God's thinking about those sets. Cool. Now the problem is that these sets are like actually existing things under realism. So we could just we could step outside for a second. We could imagine that we're actually looking at all those sets. They're just before us, and it's all really pretty because I imagine sets as glowy orbs, but that's just me. So we look at all these glowy orbs, and I'm like, hey, all those sets over there, they exist, right? So why isn't there a set which contains all of them?
Well, for any number of ZFC sets you're looking at, you can have a set of all those sets. But the point is, there are infinitely many larger sets than the one you've just constructed. You just explained why there is no set of all sets. We know why there isn't one the same way we know there's no largest natural number.
My interlocutor might say, hold on, the iterative hierarchy doesn't allow you to have a set of all sets. A set which is defined as containing all sets is impossible.
Yes, that's exactly my point. We can explain why there is no set of all sets, so why argue that the lack of one is somehow a problem?
I'm like, okay, I get that, but all those sets over there, all those glowy orbs I'm looking at, why isn't there a set which contains them? If it did exist, then the rules would take off and start building sets on top of the one that I just produced.
Exactly, which is why it's not a set of all sets.
But why doesn't that set currently exist? And that's actually a really difficult question to answer, because on the Platonist account, those if the members of a set exist, then the set itself should exist. So that this mysterious set we're thinking of, there's no real explanation under Platonism for why it doesn't exist.
This is hardly a problem for Platonism. Take any collection of ZFC sets. On Platonism, all these sets exist, and so there should also exist a ZFC set that contains them all. And indeed, such a set does exist. For any collection of ZFC sets you select, there is a ZFC set that contains them all. But there's no set of absolutely all ZFC sets, because you can always construct a bigger one. If this isn't clear, then an analogy with the natural numbers could help. The argument is that because you can imagine all of the sets in ZFC, and you can imagine making a set out of all those sets, then there's a problem with Platonism, because there is no such set of all sets. But this argument is flawed in the same way that this analogy about natural numbers is flawed. Suppose that you can imagine all the natural numbers. You can imagine that there must be some number of all natural numbers, a largest number which describes how many natural numbers there are. Since there isn't a number of all numbers, there must be a problem with Platonism. In one sense, the flaw with these arguments is very obvious. There is no largest number, and there is no set of all sets, so it makes total sense that these things don't exist, because they're not mathematically consistent entities. But there is a more subtle flaw which strikes more truly, I think, to the point that the argument is trying to make. On Platonism, all the sets in ZFC exist. If all of these exist, then it seems strange to think that there isn't some collection of all of these sets that also exists. We can talk about the whole collection, the totality of ZFC sets, but such a thing doesn't exist on Platonism, so there must be a problem. Well, it turns out actually that there may be no set of all sets, but there is such a thing as the totality of all ZFC sets. It's just not itself a set. Let's go back to the natural numbers. There is no largest natural number, but we can still refer to the totality of natural numbers. And we can even have a number of all natural numbers. The number of all natural numbers is infinity. Infinity isn't the largest natural number, since it's not a natural number at all, but it can still be understood as the number of all natural numbers. In the same way, there is no largest set in ZFC. There is no set of all sets, but there is such a thing as the totality of all ZFC sets. Let's call the totality of all ZFC sets the class of all sets. The class of all sets is not a set, since the set of all sets is mathematically inconsistent. But we can still have the class of all ZFC sets, and this would exist on Platonism. It comes down to what objects you can define. In ZFC set theory, we only have sets, and the axioms they obey means that you can't have a set of all sets. There is, however, a collection of all ZFC sets, and so we can extend ZFC set theory to something called von Neumann-Bernays Gödel, or NBG set theory, which introduces classes alongside sets. In NBG set theory, there is a class of all sets.
Under conceptualism, though, you can give a very interesting account of the nature of sets. They are the product of God's mental activity. He has to think about creating a set. He has to do the free choice to build a set. So under this account, the reason why there isn't a set of all those glowy orbs that I'm looking at, all those sets, is because God just hasn't freely decided to do it.
There is a really big problem with this reasoning. The argument here is that the set of all sets doesn't exist because God simply hasn't freely chosen to think it into existence. But remember, we know why there is no set of all sets. It's impossible to construct one in ZFC. So, if the only reason such a set doesn't exist is because God hasn't thought of it, that implies that God is capable of conceptualizing this impossible entity, which means that God can bring an impossible entity into existence. You get the same problem if you suggested that the only reason a largest number doesn't exist is because God hasn't thought of it. There is no largest number because it's impossible. If God could conceive of a largest number, then he could conceptualize and hence bring into existence impossible things. Now, most theists believe God to be omnipotent, but there are all sorts of problems if you believe God can do impossible things. So being able to do impossible things doesn't usually fall under the remit of omnipotence. If the alternative to Platonistic set theory is to believe in the existence of a God that can do impossible things, I think the former is much more plausible.
Hold on, does that mean God could have decided to just not think of any sets? Well, yes, but God is a good God, so he would presumably create sets so that our mathematical formulas that we write on chalkboards and stuff, and those sets that we're talking about, do actually refer to something. So God has at least thought of those sets.
Would a good God really bring into existence mathematical objects? It seems to me that mathematics causes plenty of pain for many high school students. Anyway, that's it for this set theory argument. It gave me a nice excuse to talk about some mathematics and set theory, but apart from that, it really isn't worth taking seriously. To be as charitable as I can to this argument, I think it had a nice point that if we can conceptualize the totality of ZFC sets, then there should be something that exists on Platonism that is this totality. But such a thing does exist on Platonism. It's just not a set. It's a class. So there is no set of all sets, but there is a class of all sets. Even if this weren't the case though, divine conceptualism would offer no solution. If God could bring into existence a set of all sets merely by thinking about it, then God could do impossible things, which is something that leads to many problems. Thank you very much for watching, and I hope you enjoyed. Please leave a like and subscribe. Appearing on this channel, a YouTuber by the name of Apologetics Squared argued that set theory offers existence for God's existence. That didn't make sense.